The next type of component we're going to talk about are button groups. And button groups are kind of just like they sound. They're a group of buttons all seamlessly placed together. And the way that we create them is by nesting buttons within this div element that has a class of button group assigned to it. So this is essentially all we need to add to our HTML around the buttons that we want grouped together. And then from there, we can just simply add buttons as we please within this div element. So we see here we have a group of 3 buttons, all with the class BTN and BTN default, which we're already familiar with. And by nesting them in this div element with the button group class assigned to it, Bootstrap is going to format these into a nice group of buttons. Let's go to the browser to see what I mean. And in our browser, we see that we have these 3 buttons that have no margin to the right or to the left of them. They're all placed right next to each other in kind of a seamless format. But there's even more we can do with button groups. One thing we can do with button groups is change the size of the buttons within the group. And what's nice about button groups is that we can add a class at the button group level rather than having to add at each individual button level. Here's what I mean. For instance, if we want to make our buttons large, we simply add this button group large class to our div element rather than having to say button-large in each one of these buttons. And this makes all of our buttons large. Large isn't the only size though. We can also make our buttons small as well as extra small. You'll notice there's no median button group, and that's because our default button group is essentially that medium button group. But we can add additional classes to make our button group large, small, or extra small. Now let's go to the browser to see how each of these looks in comparison to one another. And we see, just as we'd expect, the large button group has more padding between the text and the borders of the button. Our default button group is kind of in the middle. Our small button group has less padding as well as smaller font size. And our extra small has even smaller font size and less padding as well. Of course, from the last section, you may be wondering, and the answer is yes, we can add drop-downs within a button group. Let's take a look at how we might do that. In order to place a drop-down within our button group, we first need to nest another button group div element inside of our existing button group. From there, we simply need to place the 2 elements we're already familiar with drop-downs inside of our button group element. Those are the button as well as the unordered list, and these should look very familiar from the last section. We simply have this button that has a class of drop-down toggle assigned to it, as well as an attribute with drop-down as its value. And then we have this unordered list with the drop-down menu class assigned to it. One thing I want to point out is that in the last section, we had a div with a class of drop-down, and we kind of hypothesized that this data toggle value of drop-down was associated with that class name. But it turns out that's actually not true. In fact, this data toggle attribute is more associated with the JavaScript that powers this drop-down element, and we really don't need to worry about that for now. All we need to be aware of is that we need to include it in any drop-down so that Bootstrap's JavaScript can pick it up and display our unordered list as a drop-down. But that's it. Let's go to the browser to now see how our button group looks with a drop-down added into the group. And it looks great. We have this drop-down now added to our button group, and we can verify this by clicking on it and seeing that our unordered list items properly display. Now the last thing that I'd like to take a look at with button groups is how to make them group vertically rather than horizontally. Let's go back to our text editor to see how to do this. And it's actually rather quite simple. Rather than using the button group class, we want to use the button group vertical class. Let's take note of the difference by viewing the browser one last time in this section. No surprises when we do, our buttons are now grouped vertically rather than horizontally.